It is the 19th of September, 1944, and the bridge at Arnhem is burning. Corporal James Sherwood of the 1st Airborne Division is pressed flat against a shattered brick wall on the northern approach, his breath coming in short, ragged pulls. The street ahead of him is a canyon of smoke and falling masonry, lit orange by fires that have been burning since yesterday. Somewhere in that murk, he can hear the unmistakable mechanical grinding of a German armored vehicle, the clanking, deliberate rhythm of a Tiger tank working its way up the road. The sound alone is enough to hollow a man out. At 57 tons, a Tiger could absorb almost everything the British infantryman carried and keep moving. Almost everything. Sherwood has with him a weapon that looks, and often behaves, as though it was assembled in a garden shed. It is roughly 1 meter long, weighs just over 14.5 kilograms, and fires a shaped charge bomb using a spring mechanism so powerful that cocking it requires the firer to brace the back cap against the ground and throw his entire body weight forward. Soldiers have dislocated shoulders attempting it. The weapon has no trigger in the conventional sense. Its effective range, the range at which a trained soldier might reasonably expect to hit a vehicle, is roughly 100 meters. Against a Tiger tank with armor up to 110 millimeters thick, the margin for error is essentially zero. The weapon is called the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. The British Army calls it the PIAT. What Sherwood does in the next 3 seconds will earn him a mention in dispatches. What the PIAT does in that same 3 seconds will confirm something that the weapon's critics had spent 3 years refusing to believe, that this improbable, ugly, mechanically brutal device works. The question of why Britain needed the PIAT at all, and why it took the form it did, begins not in 1944 on a burning bridge in Holland, but years earlier in the deserts of North Africa and in the strategic catastrophe of Dunkirk. Because the PIAT was not invented in a vacuum. It was invented in desperation, and desperation, it turns out, is a surprisingly effective design brief. By the summer of 1940, Britain's anti-tank capability was, to put it charitably, inadequate. The retreat to Dunkirk had stripped the army of most of its heavy equipment. The boys' anti-tank rifle, the infantry's primary man-portable anti-armor weapon, had been designed against the light tanks of the 1930s, when armor was measured in millimeters rather than centimeters. Against the newer Panzer III and Panzer IV variants rolling into France, the boys was firing its 13.9 millimeter rounds against plating it simply could not penetrate. Soldiers reported rounds bouncing off at close range. The weapon that was supposed to kill tanks was, in practical terms, annoying them. The War Office understood the problem, but faced a brutal constraint. Britain in 1940 was not short of courage or ingenuity. It was short of raw materials, manufacturing capacity, and time. Any replacement had to be cheap enough to produce in vast quantities, simple enough to be manufactured across dozens of civilian factories with minimal retooling, and robust enough to survive conditions ranging from the Western Desert to the Burmese jungle. It also had to be man-portable, something a single infantryman could carry, deploy, and operate without specialist training. The Americans were developing the bazooka, a rocket-propelled system that would prove effective but required a reliable supply of propellant charges and a degree of manufacturing precision. The Germans had the Panzerfaust, a one-shot disposable weapon of alarming simplicity but limited range. Britain, characteristically, went in a different direction entirely. The solution that emerged from the Ministry of Supply's Weapons Research Division drew on a principle that had existed in theoretical form for decades: the spigot mortar. Instead of using a tube with a propellant charge to launch a projectile, a spigot system places the propellant inside the bomb itself, which fits over a central rod, the spigot, and is launched by the detonation of its own tail charge. It was a mechanically eccentric idea. It was also, in the hands of the right engineer, transformatively practical. Wait. The man responsible for turning that principle into a fielded weapon was Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a British Army officer whose career might generously be described as unconventional. Blacker had already produced the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar used by the Home Guard, and had long believed that the spigot principle could be scaled and refined into something an infantryman could carry into close assault. The development work was taken up at the Armament Research Department at Fort Halstead in Kent, where engineers faced the challenge of creating a weapon that was simultaneously powerful enough to penetrate tank armor, light enough to be carried by one man, and safe enough not to kill its operator in the process. The core of the PIAT's function is worth understanding in some detail, because it is simultaneously ingenious and almost unbelievably simple. The bomb, which weighed approximately 1.36 kilograms, sat in a tray at the front of the weapon and was held against the spigot, a steel rod projecting from the body of the device. When the trigger was pulled, a massive spring, the same spring that required such extraordinary effort to compress during cocking, drove the spigot forward into the tail of the bomb with tremendous force. This detonated the propellant charge inside the bomb's tail, which fired the bomb downrange while simultaneously driving the spigot rearward with enough force, in theory, to recock the spring for the next shot. In practice, the automatic recocking was unreliable. In cold conditions, mud, the Netherlands in September, it frequently failed entirely, requiring the operator to perform the full manual cocking procedure whilst under fire. This meant lying on one's back, placing the back cap of the weapon on the ground, and physically compressing a spring rated at approximately 90 kilograms of force. Soldiers who managed this whilst being shot at were regarded by their colleagues with a mixture of awe and mild concern. The warhead itself used a shaped charge, technically known as a hollow charge or Monroe effect round, in which the explosive is formed around a conical copper liner. On detonation, this liner collapses inward at extraordinary speed, focusing the explosive energy into a concentrated jet of superplastic copper, traveling at roughly 8 kilometers per second. At the ranges and angles for which the PIAT was designed, this jet could penetrate up to 100 millimeters of homogeneous rolled armor, sufficient, in 1942, to defeat most German armored vehicles through their side and rear plating. The entire weapon weighed 14.5 kilograms. It measured just over 99 centimeters in length. It could be broken down into sections for transport, though this was rarely done in practice. Production was distributed across multiple British manufacturers throughout 1942 and 1943, with estimates. Some records remain classified or incomplete, suggesting that somewhere between 100,000 and 115,000 units were produced by the end of the war. Factories that had been making agricultural equipment, sewing machine components, and bicycle frames were retooled to produce the springs, the spigot assemblies, the trigger mechanisms that held those springs under tension. The PIAT first saw significant operational use in North Africa in 1943, where British and Commonwealth forces encountered German armor in conditions that tested both the weapon and the men carrying it. The terrain of Tunisia offered limited cover, and the effective range of 100 meters, already short by any measure, felt very short indeed in open desert. But the weapon worked. Gunners who closed to within effective range, who held their nerve long enough to let a tank fill the sight picture, found that the shaped charge did exactly what it was designed to do. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Sicily followed, and then Italy, where the close country of hedgerows, stone walls, and village streets suited the PIAT's limitations better than open ground. Operators learned quickly that the weapon was most effective from prepared positions, a building, a ditch, a pile of rubble, where concealment could compensate for the weapon's restricted range. They also learned that the PIAT was nearly silent in comparison with rocket-based weapons. It produced no backblast, no plume of exhaust gases, no telltale signature that would immediately betray the firer's position. In that respect, it was more tactically discreet than the bazooka, and significantly more so than the Panzerfaust. It was in Normandy and the subsequent campaign in Northwest Europe that the PIAT's use became most thoroughly documented. Sergeant Charles Coward, Sergeant Tom Durant, and dozens of other soldiers accumulated decorations for actions in which the PIAT played a central role. The weapon that critics had dismissed as inadequate was in the hands of determined infantry, proving to be a serious threat to German armor, not because it could destroy a Tiger from the front, but because it could destroy almost anything from the flank, and because German tank commanders had begun to fear it. The weapon against which the PIAT is most frequently measured is the American M1A1 bazooka, and the comparison reveals as much about national industrial philosophies as it does about weapons design. The bazooka used a 60mm rocket motor to propel its shaped charge at a muzzle velocity of roughly 83 meters per second. Its effective range was approximately 150 meters against point targets, meaningfully greater than the PIAT's 100 meters. It was lighter at 5.9 kilograms, required 2 operators for ideal performance, and produced a distinctive backblast that restricted its use in enclosed spaces. The PIAT's effective range of 100 meters was shorter, and its weight of 14.5 kilograms was substantially greater, roughly 2.5 times the bazooka's weight. In direct terms of portability, the bazooka had a clear advantage. But the absence of backblast was not a minor detail. In the close fighting of Normandy Bocage, Italian hill towns, and the urban battles of Germany in 1945, the ability to fire from inside a building, from a prepared cellar, from a position completely enclosed by walls, was operationally significant. Bazooka operators in enclosed spaces risked the backblast killing their own position. PIAT operators did not. The German equivalent, or rather the closest German approximation, was the Panzerfaust, a single-shot disposable weapon that required no cocking, produced a visible exhaust signature, and was devastatingly effective within its 30 to 60 meter range. The Panzerfaust was cheaper to produce, easier to train, and utterly disposable. It was also, unlike the PIAT, a one-shot proposition. A PIAT team that successfully cocked their weapon after firing could engage multiple vehicles. A Panzerfaust user threw the empty tube away and reached for another. What no German weapon achieved was the peculiar combination of reusability, silence, and shaped charge penetration that the PIAT offered. The Panzerschreck, Germany's version of the bazooka, reverse-engineered from captured American examples, had the range and the penetration, but shared the bazooka's backblast problem and required a face shield to protect the operator from exhaust gases. It weighed 9.5 kilograms unloaded. The PIAT's place in history rests not only on what it destroyed, but on what it prevented being destroyed. In the streets of Caen, in the rubble of Ortona, on the approaches to Arnhem, the presence of PIAT teams forced German tank commanders to operate with a degree of caution that affected their tactical decisions at every level. A Tiger tank whose commander knew that British infantry were carrying anti-tank weapons effective at 100 meters, and who understood that 100 meters in a European town is the width of a street, was a Tiger tank whose commander was looking for infantry before he was looking for targets. The psychological effect of man-portable anti-tank weapons on armored operations is difficult to quantify precisely, but the historical record is consistent on one point. The proliferation of weapons like the PIAT fundamentally changed the relationship between infantry and armor. Tanks that had operated in urban environments with near impunity in 1940 could not do so by 1944. The PIAT was not solely responsible for that shift, but it was a significant part of it. The weapon's post-war career was brief. The PIAT remained in British Army service until the early 1950s, when it was replaced by the Inerga rifle grenade and subsequently by the 84mm Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, a Swedish design that addressed the range limitations of the PIAT's concept whilst retaining the principle of a man-portable anti-armor system. Israel used the PIAT extensively during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, where it proved effective against the light-armored vehicles in that conflict. The Israeli Defense Forces adapted and modified their supply of PIATs with the pragmatic ingenuity that characterized their early military period. Several surviving PIATs can be examined today. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples, as does the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, where the weapon sits in context among the vehicles it was designed to defeat. Handling replicas have occasionally been manufactured for historical reenactment groups, and those who have attempted to cock one, even a replica with a weakened spring, report that the exercise provides an immediate and visceral appreciation for what soldiers in the field were routinely expected to accomplish under fire. Return then to Arnhem. Return to the smoke-filled street, the burning rubble, the sound of 57 tons of German engineering grinding toward a man lying flat against a wall. Corporal Sherwood is not thinking about the weapon's spring rate. He is not thinking about the penetration characteristics of shaped charges or the manufacturing tolerances of the trigger mechanism or the 17 distinct engineering compromises that went into the PIAT's design. He is thinking about the angle of the tank's approach, about the distance. Is it 50 meters yet? Is it close enough? And about the fact that he has one shot, and that if the spring fails to recock and he survives the first round, the rest of what happens will be entirely a matter of luck and proximity. The PIAT fires. The spigot drives forward. The tail charge detonates. The bomb travels the remaining distance in a fraction of a second, and the shaped charge does precisely what Lieutenant Colonel Blacker's engineers designed it to do 4 years earlier in a research facility in Kent. The vehicle stops. Whether it is destroyed or simply disabled, whether the crew bails out or sits frozen inside, those details belong to the operational record, fragmentary and incomplete. What the record is clear on is simpler than that. The tank stops. That is the story of the PIAT in miniature. Not elegance, not precision engineering in the manner of a Swiss instrument or a German optical sight. Something rougher than that, and in its roughness, something more honest. The PIAT was a weapon that asked a great deal of the man who carried it. Physical strength, proximity to the target, nerve steady enough to wait until the range was right, and in return offered him a fighting chance against an enemy that should, by all conventional military logic, have been beyond his reach. It was manufactured in factories that had been making bicycles. It was cocked by men throwing their full body weight against a 90-kilogram spring. It was aimed, effectively, by getting close enough that missing was almost as dangerous as being hit. And it worked. Not because of what it was, because of what the men who carried it were willing to do with it. That is the PIAT. Ugly, brutal, improbable, and real. And somewhere in a burning street in a Dutch city in September 1944, it was exactly enough.